Okay, they need to hear this.
Yes, thanks. Yeah, hands up, please, Gary. Yeah, Gary is back in the list. Just have to get Sid on it.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, thanks for joining us, everyone. This is really exciting. This is fun. Heather has asked me to kind of play host today. So I wanted to start, she's not here, but we're going to talk about her anyway, but I just wanted to start by acknowledging Heather, actually, and all the work that she has done to put this together. In a way, it's just like, well, it's just, you know, a weekend, but Sid is super particular, so it's very hard to work with. No, he's great. It is a lot of work when you put something together. There's a lot of moving pieces, a lot of little details, and Heather's done a lot of work, so I'm really grateful. When Heather and I first started working together, she talked about her passion and desire for helping parents and helping equip parents and how important that was. That was one of her first things, like, hey, if I'm in this role, we really gotta talk about this. And so she said, who's someone really good and helpful that we can bring? Hey, Devin.
Hey. It's good to get you right in front, Devin. It's a little late. Appreciate you brought the coffee.
Heather said, who's someone really good that we could bring in to speak to parents? So I gave her a list of like 3 names, and then a week later she came back and said they're all not available. So I said, well, maybe we could ask Sid. No. Sid was our #1 name. I gotta be careful, he's my boss now, so I'm...
What's your boss?
Oh, we see that happening.
Is that executive pastor position still open?
We might as well get it all out there.
That's right. We're just going there now. Yeah. So, no, I told Heather, hey, if we can get Sid, and that's going to be great. So Heather did that. She reached out to Sid and did that work. So Heather, we're just thanking you for your work. So I'm thrilled that Sid's here. I just want to introduce you to him. Sid is currently living in Kelowna, him and his wife Jen. Jen is the executive director at Green Bay. And so camp ministry people, if you want to talk to Sid about that kind of stuff, that would probably be helpful. They're very involved in the camp world. Sid has been involved in the youth ministry world for a very long time. He has been my #1 go-to. When I was a youth pastor for a decade, he was always the first phone call I made when I was struggling with something, or when I was trying to figure out, you know, what do we do with this, or how do we maneuver these things? And Sid was always he's ready to call. My dad was #2. So. And then I fact checked you. I'd say, what would you not do, Dad? I go, okay, I'll do the opposite. That's great. And so I'm thrilled that Sid's here. I've now had the privilege to work for Sid up until today, apparently, with Youth Worker Community and Truth Matters, and I'm working with the Coalition. So you can untangle those 3 for us. That would be great. Lots of people ask about which one is it. It's all of them. But I'm working with the Coalition, as you guys know, with our school, and so it's been really cool working with Sid. So, everyone here, I am thrilled that you get to meet my good friend Sid. Sid, I'm thrilled that you get to meet a lot of really, really cool people. So, Gospel Chapel. This is my boss. Do not embarrass me. That would be great, especially my parents.
Yeah. You've earned the right. Oh, you have earned the right.
And Sid, there's about 90% of my financial support in this room. So, you know, just keep that in mind. You know, if some drop after the weekend, I'll just let you know the shortfall. Yeah, great. That'd be good.
Thank you, Ben.
Okay, I'm going to pray, and you guys have heard me talk enough over the last 13 years. Let's hear from Sid. So, Lord, we just thank you so much for today, and it is exciting for me as kind of a connector piece here, but just that we can all be together. I just love this church, I love this family, and these people who are here today. And Lord, I thank you for Sid and his leadership and his thoughtfulness. the way that he prepares and just thinks through these things. And so I just pray you speak through him, and that we just be blessed by him today. And that we would be a blessing for Sid as well this weekend, and that this would just be a lot of fun, and we can just enjoy time together and enjoy time with you, Father. And so we thank you, and again, thank you for Heather, the work that she has done, for Gwen putting the meal together today, and others who have been helping with childcare today, so parents can take this this day in as well. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen.
Thanks, Ben. Hey, good morning, everybody. This is a privilege to be here this morning. This is not the first time, of course, that I've been at Grand Forks. Ben and I were talking about it. There's been a number of times that I've been here. The very first time I came, we were just talking about it, was for Grow For It. So I was youth pastoring. I think I was in Canmore at that time. I started pastoring in Canmore. I was there for 4 years. Lethbridge for 11 years. That's when Brittany and Megan lived in our basement, actually, for what, was it a year? Were you guys in there for almost a year, a semester or something like that? Yeah, so Brittany and Megan lived with us there for a bit, and we were in Lethbridge for 11 years, and now we've been in Kelowna for 11 years. It was funny, when I left Lethbridge, I was part-time traveling and speaking with Truth Matters Ministries, which is our parent organization. And the vision of Truth Matters Ministries was to help the next generation see and experience the truth of Jesus Christ. That was our vision. And we had 3 primary ways that we were doing that. We were informing parents. Back then, I was not the parent of teenagers, and so I wasn't talking about parenting teenagers at all. In fact, I remember the exact moment when I made a decision that I was not going to be doing parenting seminars anymore. I had a buddy of mine ask me in Edmonton to come up and to do a parenting seminar, and I was like, hey, I don't think I can really do this, to be honest with you. He goes, no, it's going to be great, we really need you there. And so I came in and immediately discovered that all of the parents in the room, their kids were moving from high school to life after high school, and they wanted answers, and my kids hadn't reached adolescence yet. And I just remember feeling so much that I had nothing to offer in that space. So when we first started Truth Matters, we did some informing in terms of what was happening in culture for parents. And then we did time inspiring students, so speaking directly to students. And then the third area was equipping youth workers. And so we just knew that next to parents, youth workers were best positioned to help students grow in their relationship with Jesus Christ. And we were uniquely positioned to help equip them to do so. And so we started spending more and more time in that area. And as I got a little bit older, that whole area or arm of Truth Matters became youth worker community. And so that's what we kind of branded that area as, and then we started to grow and develop that area. That became kind of our most public space forward, if you will. And so now under that umbrella, we run conferences across the country, training and equipping volunteer youth workers especially. So we really believe that if we could, and Ben really embodied that here. Ben and Shayla early on were talking about how do we help equip our volunteer youth workers to be the primary shepherds in kids' lives, again, next to family, of course. And so I remember having those conversations, but there's always been kind of 2 parts of that. Number one, if we can help equip volunteers to see themselves more as shepherds than chaperones, we know that students need anywhere from 2 to 5 older people that are modeling faith for them, beyond just their parents, if that's transformative for them, then we'd have a real chance to see faith deeply formed in their lives. And so how do we design ministries for that? But secondly, if we can help our volunteer youth workers really see what it is to disciple students within church context, they will become the lay leaders of that church for decades to come. And there's no better environment to actually experience the kind of shepherding work that God calls us to do as the body of Christ together, I think, than in that space. And so that became a real passion for us. And so now we have conferences that help train youth workers. We do 6 of those across the country. And we have digital resources that we do online. We do research. I'll talk about some of the research we do here. And right now we're doing a new research project. I was just talking with our researcher last week on how social media is affecting the faith formation of young people. And so we're working on that pretty hard, and we're excited about that. And then we have the Coalition for Youth Ministry Leadership, where we train and equip vocational youth workers. And Ben works in that department for us. And I was just mentioning at the table, there's something personal there. In one sense, I feel like I need to come forward here and say sorry to you. You are in the midst of a search process, I would assume, to kind of find someone to fill that leadership a void in your church, just so you know you're in good company. We currently do not have enough leaders graduating from our institutions to fill the voids that currently exist right now in churches across our country. And we were just in meetings the other day about the need to rebuild the ministry leadership pipeline, starting in our youth ministry and moving onward and figuring out how can we do that. And so Ben, while leaving here, has created a void, is working with us to figure out how we can rebuild a pipeline to fill those voids and beyond in our country. And so I just want to say thank you to you for supporting him in what he's doing. The work is really important. I do think that the ministry leadership crisis is one of the more significant crises for the church in Canada that we're not talking about very much, and we're having a very hard time strategically addressing it. And we get to be invited to some pretty unique meetings right now. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's because we've just stayed in it for a long time and not as many have. But we were in meetings in Toronto with the heads of Bible colleges across the country and denominational heads and some of the heads of other churches, just trying to talk through what could this look like for us to fight to rebuild this. And Ben is working with us right on the ground to help make that happen. And so I do want you to know that even though there has been a bit of a pain here that's been caused in his leaving, we're praying that the Lord would use your generosity to us to make a difference in the church broadly across our country. That's our prayer, so we're thankful for that. So that's a little bit of context for Ben. My first time I was here, by the way, was when I was at Grow For It, your youth event that you used to do in a field somewhere in the middle of nowhere. That was really awesome trying to find that place. and there was the Pauls. It was the Pauls, like it was your pastor. I remember pulling up, and I pulled up, and as I pulled up, I had to slam on the brakes a little bit because a young, probably middle school student came running past the front of my car, being chased by probably a high school student who was wielding an axe. And I remember just thinking, oh, this is a really different camp experience. Like, we kind of have policies around that stuff. Right? It's like, no chasing other campers with axes. So that's kind of a little bit of a plan and protect issue. And so that was my first time that I was here, which was great. And then I got to bring my kids and my wife here as well. Jen and I both grew up in the prairies, small town prairie people. And so we love being in this is kind of our space. We grew up in small camps that just made much of little, and it was awesome, and we're really thankful for it. So we brought our boys. We wanted them to experience Grow For It, and they sure did. In fact, they were so excited they found enough bones to put together a full cow. I think. That was awesome. They were pretty excited about that, and so we really loved it. It's funny. My youngest son is heading to Briarcrest this fall. So he's 20, my oldest is 23. And he's heading to Briarcrest. And I remember he came to me and he goes, Dad, there's going to be nothing to do there. I was like, what are you even talking about nothing to do there? I said, by the way, your life isn't that exciting right now, in case you're wondering. You're living in the basement of your parents' house, all right? So like, good luck, buddy. And then I remember saying to him, I said, son, I love my time there. Like, it was unbelievable. I go, Dad, you grew up in Elkhorn, Manitoba. I'm in the city. And I was like, oh, dude, you need to get out of the city real fast. So we're booting him out of our house. We're really excited about that. And he's gonna move there. My oldest son, Peyton, is currently, he just started as a youth pastor in Abbotsford. So he's at Central Heights Church in Abbotsford. And let me just pause for a second. I'm not sure where all of you are at in terms of your journey with your kids. Some of you are probably preteens. Some of you are in adolescence. Some of you are obviously grandparents, I hope, or else Abraham, Sarah, bless you. Like, that's your calling. Just bless you. You know what I mean? I said to Jen the other day, she was sick. I'm like, you don't think, do you? I'm like, oh, praise the Lord. I'll just finally from this position, I can get a little bit of a word of hope in. And by the way, this stage of life, moving from having kids in the home to moving kids out, was the hardest journey that I had in all of it. It was funny, I said I felt like, even though I didn't always get it right when my kids were teenagers, I felt like I understood that journey a little bit. This one, young adult, I was like, no clue. So we were winging it. And I remember, just going for a run, going, Lord, you're going to have to help me figure this thing out, because I'm not sure the way I'm relating to my boys right now is helping. I think it might be hurting, if I'm really honest. I was reading a book on seasons of parenting, and they said, and this is the language they use. They said, when your kids are little, you're an owner, And you tell them what to do, and that's your responsibility, and you gotta do it, and you gotta build the boxes and the spaces for them to function in, and create safety and security, and is a foundation for a real healthy journey as they grow older. He said then when they start hitting about, age 6 and up, that next 6 years, you start moving towards a manager. And so you're starting to manage their world a little bit. You're not the one that always owns it. They're making a few decisions, but you're solving the problems and you're positioning them right. So then as they hit kind of like towards later adolescence, you start to become a bit of a coach. Do you know what I mean? And you give them some direction, but they gotta suffer, they gotta make decisions, they gotta learn to live with some of the consequences, and you help, lead them through that. I remember when Peyton got cut from the basketball team, and he was such a bitter, angry boy over it. And there was obviously something way more going on than basketball, correct? And I remember finally sitting down with him and just saying, hey buddy, if you'd like to be bitter and angry, if that's how you'd like to roll, that's your choice, and you can do that. But I said, there might be another option. I said, if there's a point where you're ready to ask the Lord, okay, Lord, what is it you want to do with me through this? I said, then there's another space that God might want to take you into. And I remember just saying, one of the steps you could take would be to sit down with your coach and just ask him, what do you need to do different for next year? And I said, that's a pretty scary step. It asks a lot of you, but you'd never know how God wants to work through that. It was so fascinating. He didn't tell me, but he went and met with his coach. He wouldn't let me know. PK we had a little bit more of attention, but I became his boss at camp over the last few years. Jen hired our organization to oversee our staff. And I got to read his application and read how God worked through that moment in shifting his identity. And I was like, what? You didn't even tell me that. But get used to it. So at that point, you're a coach. And then as they get older, you kind of become a consultant, is what I'm told. I'm not very good at consulting. I like telling. Someone said the other day, they said, Sid, unsolicited advice at this stage of life always is experienced as criticism. And I was like, well, that's dumb. You should quit experiencing it like that. I think you should see it as wisdom. But anyway, we're kind of working through that. But so PK, Peyton and I, we fought a lot. But I don't know what your experience was like when you were in our home. I was not very aware, but I am talking to some people. I remember when we moved to Kelowna, and we had these wonderful neighbors that would walk across our yard, and about week 2, Peyton and I were getting after it, really getting after it. And he was angry, and I was moving him outside, gently moving him outside. And all of a sudden, he stopped, picked up a shoe, and a shoe went flying past my head, out the door, and that wonderful, nice lady was just gently walking across. Welcome to the neighborhood. I think I had that experience, but it was a journey. He started in my youth ministry in Lethbridge for 1 year, got kicked out of our youth group actually. I remember when a small group leader said, hey, we're sending your son home. I'm like, don't send him to us. That's why we hired him. And I remember that. I met his principal. He went to Christian school in Kelowna. I saw his principal just a little bit ago, and I went and immediately apologized to him. He got removed from Christian school 3 times. I remember those phone calls with their principal, and then I remember wrestling through things at camp. Funny thing about camp, when your wife's the director and your son's running around, you don't get to parent in private. So everyone got full display of our journey. And I remember when Peyton came to us and just said, I'm never doing what you do. I just want you to know that. And I said, well, thanks for the information. I said, I put food on the table for you pretty good. You know what I mean? With my, and then I'll never forget the day when he finally came to us and just said, hey, I want to be a youth pastor. I was like, are you kidding me? He goes, yeah, that's what I'm called to do. I said, well, son, you stay out of it as long as you can. And if you can't stay out of it anymore, then let's go. And so he's in it. So it's been quite the journey, and that's kind of the space we're at. And so I hope in our time here together, we'll share a little bit. The culture is shifting pretty fast, especially right now. So, it is true that no season of parenting is the same to some degree. And at the same time, God has given us wonderful principles in His Scripture that are unchanging, that we're called to continue to lean into as we pass faith on to that next generation. So we'll chat about it as we go. If you have any questions, you please feel free to ask. Now, I always say this. I am a preacher, which means I speak too much and I always think I'm right, which makes it a little bit difficult for interaction, but we'll fight through that. I know none of us here are too shy on that. So as we go, if you have any questions or pushback, then it'll be great learning for us to be able to do together as well, okay? All right, let's get started here real quick. Around your tables, I want you to answer this question. What is the first emotion that comes to mind when you think about your child's future? and what's contributing to that emotional response. So again, a child could be anyone, it could be your own child, it could be grandchildren, it could be someone in the community. Go ahead and have that conversation on your table. Let's take about 2 minutes. Go.
Depends on the kid. Total blues. I fear nothing is positive. Oh, that sounds good, and then runs with it. It's so creepy. I'm like, what's the other thing I would do though?
I think it would be a lack of emotion.
Well, but I think like fear of not being giving them the right tools they need, right? Coming from two very different thoughts, there's things that I will over instill, and so it's hard to know what are the right things. Not wanting to do it, as they, God placed them all in the plan for them, and trusting doubting or days are long.
Okay, let me pull you back in here for a second. I'd just like to hear what are some of the emotions that came up at your table. So let's start here. What were some of the words that came up?
Oh, fear.
Good to see you guys again, by the way.
Yeah.
It took me a second. Fear? Okay. Yeah, and what's driving that for you? What would be one of the drivers you heard around the table?
For me, it was uncertainty of knowing that my kid is confident in making decisions.
Yeah, it's really good. Fair. Fear, okay. What's an emotion that came up at your table?
We had helpless, hopeful, burdened, and turtle.
Turtle?
Yeah, that's when you just shut down.
Yeah, we're shutting it down, we're out. Yeah, but you do feel that sometimes it feels so overwhelming that you go, what is our next step forward? And it is very real to move back into that space. I'd be tempted to move into that space. Feel overwhelmed by it. Great. What were some of the words here in this table?
Concern.
Concern, yeah. Good. Go ahead, back there.
I think Richard and Christy stole ours. I think they were listening to our conversation. But yeah, that uncertainty, did we focus on the right things? Did we underemphasize or overemphasize the wrong things?
Wow.
You know?
Yeah, for us as parents too, right, carrying that responsibility. It's funny right now, like with Cole, so, when I look at the two boys, Peyton and I fought the most, but I never really had too many questions about his relationship with Jesus. I always felt there was a rootedness there. Cole was very confrontational, like he avoided it, but he didn't let us in on his journey very well. And we went through just a whole season with Cole. COVID was a part of it, trying to figure out church and different things like that. And I carry regrets for some of the ways that we responded in there, in terms of maybe wondering about his faith rootedness now. And that's why we did everything to send him to Bible college. Notice there's a narrative here. I'm always finding someone else to fix my child. Isn't that great? Yeah. That's your first principle number one. Get someone else.
So where does camp sign?
Okay, one or two more. What was a couple couple of words that came around the table.
Nervous, hopeful, excited.
Ooh, can you tell about that? Why excited? Where did that come from?
Yeah, Karen, why are you excited?
Have you seen our kids lately?
No, I'm just excited to see what they're gonna do and who they're gonna be and the things they're gonna try.
Come on.
And yeah, just to see where life takes them. I'm excited for that.
I sometimes wonder why it's so much easier to lean the other way towards more negative emotional experiences than it is towards the positive. Do you know what I mean? And usually when I ask the question, it is heavily weighted that way. Generally speaking, we feel that. You know, at camp, one of our responsibilities, so at the camp that we work at in Green Bay, we see camp as actually leadership development. We don't have a leadership development program. Camp is that. And so we believe that our investment in our staff, first of all, we think of primary outcomes in terms of staff leadership development and discipleship. And if we do that really well, our camper experience will be incredible, if that makes sense. But our campers give us the opportunity to do this. And part of what we do, what we see as a big responsibility is to help develop godly resilience in our staff. Where when pressure and trials and chaos comes, not only will they be able to stand firm and remain, but actually they'll grow through that into something better and something stronger. Some people would call it anti-fragility, like there's something even greater there. In fact, we had one of our pastors speak about that. He just said, you know, a flame, if it's a candle, when a wind comes, it's very fragile. You'll blow it out just like that. But if it's a forest fire and the wind comes, it creates something even more powerful. Do you know what I mean? And so part of God's sovereign work is to develop something great through trial and difficult experiences. And you know, our responsibility with our students at camp will always put leaders into that type of space at some point. We were meeting with our lead team yesterday online, and we just said, hey, just to be really clear, camp is actually designed to put you in a space where you're going to come to the end of your perceived capacity. And that'll give you a moment to be able to experience something even more. But part of what we have to do in that space, when we feel like we've come to the end of ourselves, is take a step back, acknowledge what's actually created that emotional disposition that we're in. So see that. It doesn't get to own us, but it certainly is a messenger and it indicates something to us. And then analyze that, but then place it in light of the resources that we actually have access to in order to be able to respond to that. Does that make sense? And as followers of Christ, we have infinite resources that God has given to us when it comes to our kids, yeah? Ephesians says that he is able to do immeasurably more than we could ever ask or imagine. And in fact, when we read through the scriptures, we start realizing really crazy things like, shockingly, he actually might love those kids more than we do. That they might actually belong to him more than they belong to us. That he may have sovereignly placed them in a time such as this. And that his missional vision for our children is infinitely greater than our vision for them. You know what I mean? And I think as parents, you know, one of the things that I just didn't do quite enough was to, in the midst of the struggle and the difficulty and feeling overwhelmed, reading the news, seeing the stats, watching what's taking place, to just pause and go, okay, this is real. It's creating some emotions in me, but there's something more real that's at play here. And I need it, and you know, we'll talk about it here in a minute. This is why, as parents, our need to be rooted in the truth, to be firm and established there, is probably the greatest gift that we can give to our kids. Is our rootedness in that space, because they're watching and they're asking the question, does this faith we speak about actually make a difference? In fact, when we talk to students nowadays, you know, 20, 30 years ago, if I went to a young person and said, there's a God, she'd say to me, well, prove it. So I'd go through all of my evidence, you know, the evidence that demands a verdict, and I'd prove the whole, and which is really good and valuable. But these days, kids aren't primarily responding that way. These days, when we say there's a God, the primary narrative is, well, what difference does he make? Is he going to help my anxiety? Is he going to solve the issue that's happening at home? They're asking the question, is he good? That's what they're asking. And the primary place that they're looking for answers to that question is the people in their lives, the most significant people in their lives that profess to follow him. And they're looking at the way that they respond to crisis and difficulty and challenge and struggles and relationship with each other. And they're going, is he good? Am I seeing his goodness in these most important spaces? And so there's something incredibly powerful that we simply bring to our kids when we continue to just take these steps back, pause, and be rooted in this space that God's calling, which is no small challenge. It's no small challenge. Spending a little bit of time in Psalm 78. In our conferences, we've been camping here just a little bit with our leaders. And Psalm 78 is this wonderful psalm that speaks to the importance of passing faith to the next generation. I think in some ways these are kind of like our marching orders. Deuteronomy 6 would be the other place that we would look to in the Old Testament that speaks a lot about our role and responsibility with the kids that God's placed in our care. But in Psalm 78 it says, "Give ear, O my people, to my teaching. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings of old." That's not like bad, nasty sayings. That's like sayings past that we're not as aware of as we should be. He says, "Things that we have heard and known that our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children, but tell to the coming generation the glorious deeds of the Lord and his might and the wonders that he has done." Isn't this a wonderful responsibility, you guys, that our job is to not speak to the beauty of us, not to have everything under control and on lock, but that we would actually take the responsibility to shift our kids' vision from themselves, from us, and ultimately up to the Father. Like that's actually the role that we have. Here's the question that I've been asking myself, and I've been thinking about this. I'm going, what challenges as parents do we face that if not addressed, might actually hide the deeds, might, and wonders of the Lord from the coming generation? This is a different question to ask, you know what I mean? So if I'm asking the question, primarily, and we should ask it, but if it's primarily, how do I set my kid up really well for success? Like, what do I need to do for my child? What does I need to do for my child? That's one question. There's a real weight that goes with us that I think can be overwhelming. But if I begin to realize that my job is to create space for my child to experience God and let God do that powerful work, that's something different. So it starts changing the questions I'm asking. So I'm asking, hey, what is it in me that might actually hide the deeds? Or what is it around us that I need to address? Because I'm just always trying to, if I'm going to plow a pathway, let the pathway not be to make life easy for our kids in terms of financially successful, relationship, healthy, like whatever it is. Let the pathway we plow be a pathway to see Jesus more clearly. What's getting in the way of that? One of the things that I have to wrestle with is when I started working with Truth Matters, I traveled a lot. And then when Jen started working the camp, she was busy a lot. And one of the things when we moved to Kelowna that we lost was a real embeddedness in our church. So when I was on staff in Lethbridge, we didn't just attend church. We were embedded in it. Do you know what I mean? This was our community. And all of our research right now speaks about our role of showing up consistently with our kids, embedded in a community of faith as being transformative in terms of passing faith on to them. And it was our quote-unquote ministry that actually kept us from being as consistent as we should have been. And so I carry that because I wonder if that became a real hindrance for my son Cole to see and know Jesus the way that I would long for him. And God's so gracious. Let me just pause for just a second. Just understand this. There is not a single thing that Jesus can't redeem. Amen. That's the gospel, yeah? Like, just to be really, really clear, there is not a single solitary thing that Jesus can't redeem. And if your kids are breathing, and by God's grace, so are you, there's so much hope. Like, just unbelievable hope. So even as I speak of this, inside I keep trying to preach the gospel to myself at the same time. Do you know what I mean? Which is that's pretty good practice to do. Like, let's keep reminding ourselves of the beauty of this reality. David said in Psalm 42, he said, "Why so downcast, O my soul? Put your hope in God, yet will I trust in him." He's just preaching to his heart. He's just preaching to his soul, trying to get that renewed. So we keep doing that. I just want to say that clearly. But we should take seriously asking ourselves, what might we be doing that's hiding the deeds? And how can we start to remove those? When I think about this just from a youth worker position and from a parent position, It's actually one of the questions we're asking around social media, do you know what I mean? So how is it affecting faith formation? Social media platforms have a real effect on identity formation, emotional stability, health, resilience, and faith formation in the lives of our kids. And so as parents, you know, if I was going to do a seminar on technology right now, I would say to you that the secular research is telling us that we should keep our kids off social media platforms till at least 16 or so. And that the negative effects in terms of their emotional development and identity formation are very significant and very real. And lots of the stats are really strong on that. Now here's the other thing though that's fascinating on the other side. Dr. Jean Twenge, who works out of San Diego State University, I believe is where she's a psychologist, where she teaches. I'm not a follower of Christ near as I can tell, but she said this, just so you know, kids who are physically active are weekly attending a religious organization and have lots of time in physical proximity with friends and older people, we seem to see a great reduction in the negative effects of social media spaces. And I'm like, oh, we call that camp. That's so awesome. You know? We got the answer. Let's solve this beast. This is so wonderful for us. Or we call it youth group, or we call it the church. The body of Christ being who we're supposed to be. And so there's wonderful hope within that space. But we wrestle with this. And then quickly, he goes on and he says this, he established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he had commanded our fathers to teach to their children, that the next generation might know them, the children yet unborn, and arise and tell them to their children. So now we're talking about generational work here, right? Like this is what we're doing, which is really wonderful to see like grandparents, parents in this room. You know, I think one of the great gifts that my boys have been given, this is just a gift we've been given, is that if their identity is ever shaken because maybe they have a tough relationship with their dad, which is real, they can look to then the generation ahead of that one and see, oh, there's stability there. And then they can look to extended family and see, oh, there's stability there. And then they can look to other parents who have come alongside with us and go, oh, there's like faithful. Boy, it's so beautiful to be a part of the legacy of God's work. You know what I mean? And there's something just incredibly powerful that creates like a rootedness and a strength in that space. He says, arise and tell them their children, so that they should set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments, and that they should not be like their fathers. Thank you very much. Maybe their mothers? No, just their fathers. They should not be like them. A stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation whose heart was not steadfast, whose spirit was not faithful to God. And I'm just thinking, okay, this is actually a vision of what we're called to. We're called to like help our kids set their hope in God, that their affections would be moved by Jesus. Think about that. That they would see Jesus as so beautiful and so amazing that like, all the other things would begin to fade in comparison. And that would resonate their heart. You know, one of the things I love so much is when Peyton would come back from his missions experiences with his youth pastor, Joel Feddersen, who this church shaped, by the way, in case you're wondering. And Joel's ministry has affected many generations powerfully, my kids included. And I remember when Peyton would come back and his love for Jesus was just so beautiful because he'd experienced Jesus in profound ways. You know, he would walk down Skid Row and they had to hear people's stories and they had to pray for them. And I was like, that was so crazy. I've never seen my son pray anywhere. Like, that's wild. And and so they just created this space and his heart was just set on fire in really beautiful ways. That they would not forget his works. Part of our responsibility is to share the works of Jesus in the lives of our kids. It was really interesting. My wife and I sat down with a young youth pastor couple the other day for supper, and Cole came with us, their peers. And we started sharing the stories of God's faithfulness while we were youth workers. And I realized, these are the stories of God's great work in our lives. Like when we had a family essentially buy a house for us, that like there's no way, we had no option. It wasn't happening. And God just came through powerfully. And all of a sudden Cole looked up and goes, what? And then we told the next story, he goes, what? And we told it, and he goes, what? I go, we have to sit down and continue to tell the works of God to our kids, to the next generations they can see him. And they can build faith, and then they can start to entrust themselves to Him. So grandparents, when you sit around the table and you tell the stories of how you've seen the faithfulness of God at work in your lives and over generations, that's holy, holy work that you're involved in. It's holy work. That they would keep His commandments. By the way, and we'll talk about this a little bit this afternoon, you know, again, historically, when we talk about the scriptures and God's commandments, we're trying to answer the question, you know, is it true? And we need to answer that question. But a greater work we have to do is, how is His word, how is His way good? That's the question we have to answer. How is God's design good for humanity, good for the flourishing of all people? That's sometimes a little bit harder for us to wrestle through, but we've got to do that kind of work. And then that they would develop a resilient faith, that they would be steadfast and faithful, not like the generation before them. And this is really what God is like calling us to, is to figure out how can we help develop resilient faith in the next generation. So this is our vision. And so our prayer is that just over this next like 45 minutes to an hour, that God would use our time to give us ways to better accomplish this calling that He's given to us. Okay? All right, let's dive in. Here's what we want to do. I'm going to talk really quickly, not quick, I'll try not to go too quickly, but I want to talk about 10 principles that have become really helpful for us as I reflect back when it comes to passing faith on to our kids. And what I'll do is I'll reflect on some of the research that we've done. So we did a research project back in 2011 called Hemorrhaging Faith. What we did is we surveyed over 2,000 young adults in our country who had a significant experience with church and faith as a child or an adolescent. And then we asked the question, what was it that helped you either maintain your faith and go deeper as you went through adolescence, or what was it that actually helped, caused you to walk away from faith as you went through that? So that was our first research project. The second one we did was called Renegotiating Faith in about 2018. We took a look at the transition from high school to life after high school, which our first research told us that was quite a significant space where we saw young people walk away from church and faith. And again, most of our research has said that faith and church attendance are actually quite connected. So even though we hear lots of stories of, I'm so into Jesus and I'm so into faith, but I'm not into church, practically that doesn't seem to work out the way that we would like to think it might. And so our research told us that those two things are actually quite tightly connected, especially as children go through like childhood and adolescence, that consistent physical engagement in a bigger community actually pretty powerful. So we looked at that transition and we asked what was really significant for young people to maintain faith and health as they go through that. And now we're doing one on social media. So we'll take a look at those projects, we'll take a look at the scriptures a little bit, and we'll just talk about some practical experience that we've found pretty important. Okay, here's our first principle. Number one, your voice as parents, grandparents, is the loudest voice in your kid's life. Even when you're not talking, it's the loudest voice. So I think sometimes we wonder, if our kids are in school for 8 hours a day, we take a look at the amount of time that they're spending on their screens and their platform and what our research tells us that. We wonder if our voice, in comparison to the amount of time, is our voice actually even able to shape them when so much else is shaping them? And I want you to know that everything tells us that there is no voice more powerful in a young person's life than a parent's voice, for good or for worse, just to be clear. So when we did Renegotiating Faith, the number one driver to long-term faith formation in a young person was authentic faith modeled by their parents. There was nothing that even compared to that. Now, here's what was really fascinating about it. When we talked, when we did interviews with young people in terms of their journey of faith, one thing that we were surprised they didn't speak about very much was that our family had designated Bible study time together. That actually didn't come up very much, especially for adolescents. And I was kind of thankful for that, because by the time my kids got middle to late adolescence, we were not doing, when they were children, we did Bible study every night before they went to bed. The picture Bible was a big deal. That's great. Remember, you're an owner at that point in time, and so this is what we do. It's very important, laying foundations. By the time they became adolescents, I was basically in bed by the time they were going to bed, okay? Or I was really grumpy at that point of the night. I remember one time Peyton said to me, he goes, "Dad, you say you love the Bible so much, but you're always so grumpy when you're reading it to us." That has nothing to do with the Bible. So, But here's what they did say. They said, even though that is important, we need to do it. Scriptures calls us to do it. What they did say, we had kids that said to us, to be really honest with you, in our home it was a negative because our parents would gather us for this Bible study time around the table, but it didn't seem to make any difference in how they lived out their life outside of that moment around the table. And it created a real tension trying to figure that out. What they did speak a lot was kids who said that their parents had heavily shaped their faith formation, was that they were engaged in authentic faith practices that shaped the way they lived the rest of their lives. And they said there was 3 practices in particular. My parents, I remember them reading the Bible, my parents prayed, and we went to church. Those were the 3 primary practices they talked about. And that, and then what happened is they saw how that faith journey affected the decisions they made outside of kind of the structured moments. In fact, when they talked about like teaching, they talked about the most powerful moments of teaching were moments that were related directly to life decisions in that space. So here's what we're wrestling with. Here's what we think God is calling us to do. Let's take that step. So there was such a strong connection there. It's interesting, we wanted to differentiate in some of those things, like how we did like church attendance and why and that sort of thing. Remember when Peyton was about 13 and we decided to go to a church, and Peyton was so angry he didn't want to go to that church. And he wanted to go home. Boy, hey, can I just remind you, he's a youth pastor now? Okay, so he's doing really well, just to be very, very clear. But I remember he turns to me and he goes, "You're just trying to control my faith." I said, "Heck no, son." I said, I mean, in one sense, yes, but your faith is going to be your decision between you and the Lord. It's just in our home we go to church. So if you want to live in our home, that's where we're going, buddy. So let's roll. So just, we are always trying to help him differentiate that experience for him. The point is, again, what we model really matters. And it has a powerful effect in our kids' lives, which should release a little bit of the pressure, because some of us don't feel like we're really great Bible teachers, and we're not, and that's okay. You don't have to be really great Bible teachers. You have to fight to be a Bible follower. And by Bible follower, I mean a follower of Jesus. I want to just pause here and speak about this again just for a second. Part of this relates back to the idea of, hey, I'm really into Jesus, but I'm not into church, or maybe I'm not into the scriptures. So, if I'm working with a kid and they say something to me like, yeah, I'm really into Jesus, but I'm not really into the Bible, then one of the questions I might ask is, well, tell me a little bit about the Jesus that you're into. And what's shocking in those moments is that we tend to find that the Jesus they're into seems to look a lot like them. We have a natural propensity, when we don't have an objective other that's defining the truth about Jesus for us, that we end up creating a Jesus in our own image. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And here's what's really interesting in terms of a cultural moment we have when it comes to identity formation and faith formation. In one sense, this isn't anything new. The roots of kind of the way culture understands identity was planted, a couple hundred years ago. But really started to flourish, I would suggest, in the 70s and 80s, and then now it's become common reality. So when a young person, the common cultural narrative for identity formation and therefore faith formation is this, that if you want to understand who you are, the first thing you do is you look within yourself, right? We've kind of heard that narrative, do whatever you want, your truth is your truth, you can be whoever you want to be, you're awesome, the sun sets on you. And so first look into yourself and figure out what you feel about yourself, and your emotions begin to kind of drive your sense of who you are. And then your second movement, once you've decided who you are, is to find a group of people outside of you who will affirm the identity that you have now declared as your identity. So now we look outside and we find that. And by the way, this is such a unique point in history, because never before have kids had access to an infinite number of communities to affirm whatever identity they want to speak about themselves. Correct? So it's the very first time that's happened in that way. And then what happens is your third movement now is, because we know that we were made for something greater, and there's so much movement towards spiritualism and that sort of thing, is now I look up and I create a God that can now affirm how I feel about myself. Does that make sense? Now, there are lots of problems with this way of identity, and this is part of when we start talking about, is God's way good versus right or wrong. A number of things that are difficult about this is, number one, you become very fragile in terms of your sense of self because it's really rooted in your emotional sense of self, and emotions can be easily manipulated, yes? The second thing that happens is that as soon as someone speaks against your chosen identity, now again, you become deeply injured in that moment. So this is no longer just a conversation or an argument that you're having. What's happening now is you feel yourself being specifically attacked. And so one of the problems that happens in this type of context is because people who don't think the way you think have now become a real threat to the very core of who you are, your identity. Does that make sense? The only option you have to deal with them is what? Cancel them. So that's why we have this really strong cancel culture, because as soon as you speak something against what I feel about myself, we're no longer having a conversation, I'm experiencing a personal attack and a threat. And so now I have to shut that down. So then what happens is now we live in a cultural environment where it's really hard to know what it looks like to love the other. Because by very definition, the other again is now a threat at this space. And then of course we also lack real strength and resilience because our emotions are so easily manipulated and they can be shifted and moved depending on the situation we're in. And there's all sorts of pressures we face in this space. One, our kids face a pressure to create their own identity, which is a heavy weight. What happens if I decide to be something now, but that's not who I want to be later? We as parents know when our young people make a decision about who they are at the age of 8, that there's a real chance that's not who they're going to be later. So how do we help them process through that? Like when Cole came to me and said, Dad, I'm going to be a ninja policeman. I was like, I have no imagination for what that is. I think it's cool, but son, you're a Mennonite. So that's going to be a tough one, right? Well, and so there's so much weight that's there that's so challenging and difficult to navigate. This is where a gospel identity is so useful. In a gospel identity, the first movement of identity formation is to look up to the objective other who knows you better than you know yourself because he's your creator. Yeah. So he knows you. How many of us struggle with knowing ourselves right now? I mean, I was shocked. I thought identity formation happened in adolescence. I didn't know when I turned 50, I would have a whole new world of trying to figure out right? I woke up the other day, you guys, and my arm hurt so bad, I couldn't lift it for literally a month. I was like, that's what sleeping does to you at this stage of life. So first we look up to the one who knows us better than we knows ourselves. Number 2, loves us infinitely more than we could imagine. So he is only for us in that space. And it's shown by his work on the cross. And so now when he speaks to us and tells us who we are, we can listen. We don't have to create an identity. We get to discover the identity that God has given to us. And here's what's really beautiful about that. Like, it develops this incredible strength and resilience because now our emotions are very real, but our emotions don't own us any longer. So I remember when I had a young person come to me, and I want to be careful, we're going to talk about this afternoon, it's not the only context, but let me just shape this. I had a young person come to me and he just said to me, hey, I've got these voices that are just like, they're telling me I'm gay. I'm like, okay. And for the next month, we didn't talk about that at all. You know what we talked about? We said, what does God's voice say to us about who you are? Because that's real, those emotions are real, but those voices don't get to own you. There's a voice that knows you better than you know yourself that doesn't change, that actually gets to own you. Let's listen to that. Let's hear what that voice says. And now we'll respond to all of the other voices. So first we look up, we hear his voice. Second, we now look in with the work of the Holy Spirit to align our emotions with what God says about us. That's called the journey of sanctification. And we say, okay, Lord, help align my emotions with what you would have. My emotions aren't my owner, they're good messengers, but God actually gets to develop and mature them into something more. And then third, I start to look out, not to get affirmation from others, but now as I understand who I am, to go and serve others. And that's a very different reason for looking out around me, correct? I don't know about you, but some of the best moments in my life, some of the worst moments in my life, is when I'm most aware of myself and most wondering what others think about me. And the best, most freeing moments are when I'm least aware of myself and most aware of how I'm going to go and serve other people around me. I was working with at one of our conferences, we had a new MC, she's quite nervous, and I just went to her, I said, hey Jenna, when you walk on that stage, your number one job is not to be impressive, it's to be impressed by the people out there. And you are simply called to serve them, that's all. And there's just freedom in that space, right? So, and then the other thing that happens, so here's the other beauty of that way of identity, is when we have this gospel identity in Jesus, rooted in the scriptures, so there's this objective other authority, we all of a sudden have incredible resources to be the most loving and accepting of the other. So in a cultural identity, we actually don't have resources to truly be loving and accepting of the other, because by very definition, the other ultimately might be an enemy. And again, they're a threat to us. Does that make sense? I have to cancel them. Whereas the gospel gives me these incredible resources. So number one, I don't have to be threatened by others, because I know that I was on the outside apart from Jesus, but because he came to me and brought me in, it's the only way I'm now on the inside. It's not my great works or my great, how awesome I am that's put me here. It's just grace. So now I'm inviting others on the outside. Because, I am now called at the very central core, because Jesus has loved me. He's given me incredible resources now to love the other, including my enemy. So I actually don't have a right to cancel my enemy. My only option is to actually radically love my enemy, because Jesus, the one I serve, modeled that for me, and he's empowering me to do so. And then I don't have to be afraid if I fail, because I know that there's nothing he can't redeem. You see this? And so all of a sudden, the question in culture is not what worldview is most inclusive. That's actually not the right question, because every worldview is exclusive in some way, shape, or form. Does that make sense? You're always going to exclude something. The question is, what worldview has the most resources available to it to be the most loving of those of the other? And so when we can help students or kids see that there's this identity rooted in Jesus that allows them to be strong, it allows them to be stable, resilient, and radically loving of others, that's the healthiest space that we can be in. We have to do work here. Now, where that comes from is how we model identity. And by the way, your kids will see your identity best modeled in the hardest of moments. How we respond to crisis will reveal where identity is most rooted in, yeah. And then secondly, we radically need to be committed to experiencing our identity in Jesus through his word, because they need to know that there is an objective other that they can go to discover what God is saying about us. And so we have to keep fighting to understand his word and to see how he's good. Okay, so your voice is the loudest voice even when you're not talking. Just so you know, at this rate, we're going to go about a half hour per principal, so we've got 5 more hours to go. Hey, I just want to pause there, because I think I downloaded quite a bit of stuff, and I want to see if there's any questions around that concept, especially of identity. And the point I want to end with is that this is where we have to find our identity rooted so that we can model something powerful for our kids. Any questions about that before I move on? Yes, please go.
Yeah, what was the third step in the gospel identity process?
Yeah, so first we look up, right, to see what God says about us.
Yeah.
Second, we look in to align our emotions by the power of the Holy Spirit with what God says about us. So that's that wonderful journey, that process that we're at. And then third, we look out to serve others.
Got it.
Whereas in a cultural identity, first I look in to see what my emotions say about me. Then I look out to find a community to affirm and celebrate what I say about myself. And then I look up and I build a God to help just kind of reaffirm again what I think about myself. And the biggest difference is I'm the center of the universe. So everything else is built around me. Hey, by the way, one of the great tensions that kids feel, by the way, and this is one of the lies that culture gives to us, is they live in a culture, and I think this is one of the reasons why we maybe have one of the greater mental health crises I think we're dealing with, is they live in a culture that says you can be whoever you want to be, correct, do whatever you want. But the acceptable identities or activities is very narrowly defined by the most powerful cultural voices. And they know that if they step outside of the boundaries that culture has set for them in terms of saying who they want to be, they will be immediately canceled. So, when I talked to my son, Cole, and he was talking about some of the things he was wrestling with at high school, I said, hey, buddy, what would it be like for you to tell them what you believe? He goes, oh, Dad, I couldn't do that. They tell me why? Because they'd crush me. I said, really, your friends would crush you? He goes, no, not my friends, my teacher. So the people in power are dictating how you should see yourself, and if you see yourself outside of that, they're going to come and challenge that really, really hard. And so J.K. Rowling, by the way, is a great secular example of this. J.K. Rowling was seen as an advocate for all sorts of marginalized people groups and different groups of people until she began to advocate against transgender ideology, seeing it as an attack on feminism. And so when she started to speak to that, then actually that ideological community began to attack and cancel her, and she lost millions and millions and millions of dollars because of how she was canceled by the kind of cultural environment that she was in. There's an interesting podcast on, I can't remember what it was called, something about like the canceling of J.K. Rowling, which is just fascinating to kind of see that work its way through. And that's a real cultural narrative that we're wrestling with right now. So it creates a fragile space. Okay, any other questions? Yes, please.
When you're explaining the whole cancel thing, I see potential for, if we as the body are more concerned about our traditions and our way of doing things than we are about our identity as alive, then we could easily cancel our children when they have questions that are uncomfortable.
Oh, that's so brilliant. Yeah, we really could. And this is where we have to...
And cancel is rejection, right?
Yeah, we can do that. That word can include all those kinds of experiences. And so I think in the church, one of the things that we have to wrestle with in the church, so tradition can be wonderfully helpful to carry us through chaotic seasons. So we're not against tradition, but tradition doesn't get to own us or own our faith, and tradition isn't faith. I think we have to separate those things a little bit in our minds. One of the things that, it's really interesting, if you take a look at Mark chapter 10, Jesus' disciples, Jesus is preaching to the crowds, right? And what happens in Mark chapter 10 is all of a sudden parents and other people start bringing children to Jesus for Jesus to touch the children. And you remember what happens? The disciples get really angry and they start telling the people to quit bringing their kids to Jesus. And then Jesus gets really angry and he comes to them and he says, don't hinder the children from coming to me. I think the thing that's really fascinating to me about that story is the disciples thought they were helping his mission, not hindering his mission. And Jesus came to them and said, you're hindering it. Yeah. And I think one of the things that challenges that we as the church have now, when we think about our primary responsibility of passing faith to the next generation, and I would like to suggest it is a primary responsibility, is that we would humble ourselves before the Father as leadership and pray, Lord, are there things we're doing that we think is helping faith but might actually be hindering it for the next generation, and could you reveal that to us? And I think if we take that posture, it could allow us to be a community of wisdom, to know what traditions should we hold to. Okay, let's just be really clear. We don't want our teenagers running our churches, okay? Right? We want them to be involved in all of our, in all sorts of environments. But God has called us to take the wisdom that he's given us through experience and care for that next generation. But there has to be a real humility before the Father so that it's the Spirit directing us, not our preferences directing us. And that's a challenge.
That you just hit it right there, and I'll just even clarify it further, that there's congruity between how we act in submission to the Father through everything that we do and everything that our children see us do or not do. And that's where love comes first. It's always loving him first, and which is what allows us to be able to love others effectively and via the message of the gospel. And I think there is a strong tendency in this culture that we're living in to lean heavily into first loving others. Okay, now I've looked up, now I've looked in. Okay, now I'm going to look out, and I'm going to look out and continue to look out. But it's a continuum. We're always looking out.
Yeah.
And then looking in, and then looking out.
It's really, really wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know what? That's really, really wonderful. One of the most radical, of course, commands in Scripture is to love your neighbor as you love yourself, right? Isn't that a crazy command? So now, the way our culture wants us to interpret that command is that you need to love yourself. So learn to love yourself. That's actually not what it means. It assumes that you already do love yourself. And what I mean by that is Jesus is making an assumption that we all have within us a natural movement to do whatever we think is good for ourselves, that we naturally want to move in that direction. That's just an impulse. If it's cold, we naturally want to move towards getting warm or getting clothing on. If we're hungry, we naturally want to move towards getting food. Even, by the way, the young person who is suicidal in nature, it's actually an act of, it's a very broken act of love for self, because they believe that not existing would be better than actually existing. Does that make sense? So the verse actually assumes that we naturally love ourselves. The radical nature is that we should love our neighbor as we love ourselves, with the same intensity, consistency, and commitment that we long to experience something good for ourselves. We should now go and give that to others. Do that for others. Now the tension, of course, is, okay, if I roll that way, when will I ever actually experience something good for myself? Like, it's such a radical command, which I think is why Jesus ordered the commands that first we love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and then we love our neighbor so that he becomes the overflow in our movement towards others. Let me just be really clear, you guys. Like, we can't live up to the gospel call if we aren't first looking to Jesus to be our provider for that. Emotionally, spiritually, physically, relationally. And by the way, he has designed that his grace would work through his community. So that's not a solo effort, which is one of the reasons why we fight so hard to try to figure out how to be unified as the body of Christ. You know, like, that's just part of it. That's part of the journey. And it is challenging. Like, it is challenging. Thank you for that, Dave. Okay, let me keep going. Principle 2, having fun with your children is very holy work. My kids felt most loved by their dad when they were most enjoyed by their dad. And so I remember a friend of mine who was kind of an older dude and just full of wisdom. He just said to me, hey Sid, when it's hard, just go do something fun. And so I remember in the seasons when it was hard, Jen and I were like, hey, we're getting in our car and we drove to California. We didn't have the money to do it, but we were going to figure it out. We could extend our mortgage a few years for the sake of getting through middle school. And I was like, I'm telling you, man, extend the mortgage for middle school. That's the bad. And I remember we got in that car and we just went for it. And we tried to create great shared experiences with our kids. On a more simple note, you know, our boys were into skateboarding. And I remember when Peyton and I were wrestling, I'd say, boy, we're going to go down to the skate park, get your board and get in the van. I don't want to. That's irrelevant to me. You are. So let's go. And it was amazing what happened, you know, an hour later after we'd been at the park, which meant as a 40-year-old, I too had to figure out how to get on that stinking skateboard. I immediately broke my arm, so then I quit getting on the skateboard. I was sitting with Cole when Cole was about 8. We were sitting in a hot tub, and I said, hey, son, if your dad could do anything different, what would you like him to do? And he just quiet for a second. He goes, Dad, I'd just like you to skateboard more with me. And I was like, oh, that's not going to happen. That's number 2. So we figured out number 2, you know what I mean? In Zechariah, when the prophet Zechariah is painting a picture of eternity for the people of Israel, one of the phrases he uses is he says that the children, the boys and girls, are laughing and playing together in the streets. There's very holy work to play with our kids. And in fact, we're saying something very deep to them when we can authentically have a type of joy in playing with our kids, especially when we're in a space of chaos and crisis. And we're not pretending that doesn't exist. We're not emotionally disengaged. But what we can do is, even in the tears, even in the hardship, we can experience a type of joy that's not rooted in our situation. It's rooted in the God who's over the situation. And that is powerful for their kids. You know, one of the things that Jen talks about all the time was when she was in middle school just to high school. And the farm was tenuous. And they didn't know if they were going to make it. Saskatchewan was going through a lot of drought in that time, like a lot of other places. And Dad went and bought a boat. And he said, can't be on the field this summer, but we're going to be on the lake, and so let's go. Now, there's lots of questions about how far we should go with this. You know, there's some financial stewardship maybe that we should ask. but there was a commitment to being owned by something more than just their circumstances. And so there's something just amazing. I really believe that when we can play with our kids, there's something really, really wonderful that takes place in that space. Principle number 3, you pass on discernment and responsibility by being discerning and responsible. And so again, in a cultural space where kids are experiencing more information than they've ever experienced before because of the internet and the platforms that we find ourselves on, the need to grow discernment is more important than what we've ever seen before. One of the things that we talk with parents whose kids are now our children moving towards middle school is we talk a lot about pornography with kids, with parents these days. The question is no longer will your child be exposed, but will they be prepared to respond when exposure happens? And so we talk a lot about teaching discernment to children in age-appropriate manners and ways. I remember with our boys when we said, hey, at some point you're going to probably see a naked picture on a screen. Here's how we respond when that happens. Number 1, we close down our screen. Number 2, we find mom or dad and we just let them know because we trust them or we trust another significant other person. Number 3, we think about something really good that God has given to us that we can enjoy. By the way, did you notice that third one? I thought that was so wonderful. Part of what you're trying to do is limit the amount of time spent with the image so that the imprint isn't as strong in the neurological pathways, and instead we're replacing it with something better so that it doesn't get to own. Do you know what I mean? But what we're doing is we're starting to train healthy ways of responding in a broken, sinful context that we have placed us in. Now, as parents, again, you've heard me say this over and over again, one of the best ways we can teach discernment is by modeling discernment. So we talk a lot as adults about what we're watching, why we're watching, what we shouldn't watch, why we shouldn't watch. When our boys were growing up, we had a shared Netflix account so that my boys could actually see whatever it was that I'd been looking at on Netflix. And I remember when I sat down with them and I said, hey boys, there's a movie that Dad was watching. It's not a good movie, and so I just want you to know it's up there and make sure you don't watch it. And Peyton goes, yeah, Dad, I know. Next time, could you just fast forward to the end? Because I hit that movie, and yep, that was the bad part. So we had, we had that conversation. But part of what it did is when I traveled as well, it was a big piece of accountability for myself. You know what I mean? Like my family's going to be. Now, that didn't mean we didn't have appropriate conversations. So sometimes I would say to my boys, hey boys, here's this movie that Dad's watched. It's not good for you now. It's going to be really important for you to watch later, Schindler's List. And so we talked about how it had a really important theme, but was for adults and not for children yet. So we have those kinds of conversations. One of the things that we did, by the way, with teaching discernment when it came to like popular culture is we always talked, we did this really simple when our kids were small. We talked about protein, popcorn, and poison. And so if there would be a song that would come on the radio, we'd say, hey boys, what do you know about that song? Well, not much. Well, let's listen to the lyrics for a second. Let's just talk. And sometimes I'd sit down and read lyrics to them. And then I'd say, okay, what do you think that is? Is that like protein? Is it really good for you? Is it popcorn? It's neither here nor there, it doesn't matter. Or is it poison, really bad for you? And then they would categorize those things. And then we'd say, okay, well, we never do poison, so let's get rid of that. We can only take popcorn for so long. One Direction played a role for a little bit of time, I'm not gonna lie. Gotta get rid of that. And by the way, really shocked, by the way, how many of our adolescent boys are into Taylor Swift. Anyone ever notice that? I know none of us want to admit it here, especially not those of us who are cowboy up, like we don't want to, but it's true. You play a song, they're gonna read the lyrics, like they're gonna sing it. And I was like that, and well, just a quick small aside. I know we'd like to position that as popcorn, and there's an element that we should. When was the last time that anyone heard Taylor Swift sing a song about forgiveness? And how important is it for like flourishing and freedom to be people who forgive as opposed to people who are vengeful? And my wife goes, she's shaping a generation of young leaders, of young ladies on how to think about people who have offended them. You know what I mean? I just thought, oh yeah, so we have those conversations. And then finally we talk about protein, and we want to stay in spaces that are often protein. It became a great framework to work for our kids. Now they started applying that at church. So I remember we left church one time, they're like, hey Dad, that person leading worship, yeah, I'm not sure that's protein. I was like, wait a second. Content, all protein. Gifting, 50-50. Okay, so we're cut out. So passing on the sermon responsibility. Yeah, teaching critical thinking skills can really come back to bite you. Principle number 4. You're part of a community called to raise your children and embrace the community. And this became something really beautiful. When we did Renegotiating Faith, one of the things that Renegotiating Faith told us was that the role of mentors other than parents were powerful in the life of an older adolescent. So part of the adolescent journey, of course, is this journey of differentiation as they move towards late adolescence, which means there's a little bit of separation that they try to create from some of their parents' values and practices to create space to embrace their own values and practices or make them their own so that their faith can become their own. And it's really interesting. What I see with some kids is either they'll move, kids who have grown up in the church will either become more legalistic than their parents as a way to create space. That's what I did to my dad. I was just convinced he's such a sinner. And not afraid to speak it either. I cannot believe I was not grounded for life. Or they become like, they move towards license. That can be those movements. And part of that is just like them making that work. And so part of what we wanted to do was place them in communities where they would be more known by their first name than their last name. So I wasn't involved in his youth group when we got to Kelowna. You know what I mean? And Cole had other people that were really significant roles. Their small group leaders were so important for us. And so I remember when Peyton didn't want to listen to me, but he was going to go and talk to his small group leader, which meant I was going to go talk to his small group leader so that I'd know what he's talking to my son about, right? So you get to manipulate the process. That's what you should do. But there's a real gift in terms of us being in community. Here's what we found in Renegotiating Faith. If a young person could not articulate a mentor in their grade 12 year and they moved to a new community to go to university, so they couldn't say this was who my mentor was, 1 year later, only about 15% of those students were still involved in church. Wow. If that young person could articulate a mentor who had been with them and that mentor help them find a new place of faith in the new community they went to, especially within the first 2 weeks of university, 1 year later, over 75% of those students were still involved in church. And so the role of mentor became very significant. Hey, fascinating thing when you read the scriptures, God's very serious about the nuclear family, absolutely. But Jesus spoke more about the body of Christ as family than he did the nuclear family. And so our responsibility as the body of Christ for the next generation should be something that we share, and we should lean into that. I remember my friend Tim, who was a coach for my boys, loved Jesus. When his kid was struggling in about grade 9 or 10, he said, Sid, could you spend time with Carter? I said, absolutely. And we started doing Cokes together, and I just saw him the other day. It was really cool. And I remember with Peyton and Cole, when they struggled, I called Tim up and I said, hey, Tim, any chance you can grab my boys? Absolutely. And so they didn't want to listen to me, but they listened to him, and it was just life-giving for them. Principle number 5, your kids are uniquely positioned and called to this time. And I think that this is, I've mentioned it already, that God has sovereignly called our kids into this moment. And because, there's so much that's changed culturally, and we have we're like digital immigrants in this space. Do you know what I mean? Like I remember a time before computers. All those sorts of things. Our kids have grown up in this. As God does redeeming work in their lives, they will intuitively have greater ways to radically love others than I will within this space. And I think we just have to remember that God has a missional plan for our kids, and he has called them into this moment. So we shouldn't be so afraid of this moment. Many of us long for the good old days, yeah? Let's remember that since Genesis chapter 3, there's no such thing as the good old days. There's simply the days that we've been given and that we've been called into. So this is the place that God has called and positioned them. Number 6, we need to create experiences or opportunities for our kids to experience Jesus. When we did Hemorrhaging Faith, next to parents, one of the primary indicators of long-term faith in the life of a young person was that they could say they experienced God when they were a child or an adolescent. Primary spaces that they talked about that were answered prayer, I remember answered prayer. So our role of praying with our kids is huge, or sharing our prayers with our kids. The second thing that they talked about was missions trips or camp experiences, that those are spaces where they experience God. And the third was going through hard times. And what was fascinating for me as a parent is I realized I do everything I can to keep my kids from experiencing hard times. Do you know what I mean? Because when my kids go through hard times, it's very inconvenient for me. It takes up a lot of space. There's a lot of emotions I got to manage. Like it's really, I'd like to just get rid of that hard time. Whereas I might actually, again, be hindering their faith journey as opposed to journeying with them through the hard times. Son, I think the best way you can make is go sit down with your coach. Ask the hard question. You know, instead of, or how, hey, I know it feels really unjust and unfair that the coach isn't playing you. How would God have you serve your teammates from that position? You know what I mean? Like those are, and there was everything in me that wanted to call that coach and let him know that he needed to get my kid on the floor. But God was doing something more. Like there's a greater piece at play here that's happening that I think we have to wrestle with and ask, how can we, and again, you know, I'm using illustrations that fit this cultural context that in a way feel silly, you know, like we're not struggling for food, there's lots, you know what I mean? But these are the kind of, like, this is the context we're in, so we're continuing to try to figure out what it looks like to be faithful in this space. And so journeying with our kids through hard moments creates experiences for them. You know, our missions trips that we do with our students has very little to do with the people and the context that they're going to for their missions trip. Does that make sense? Very little. And in fact, there's lots of really good ethical questions we should ask about the value of short-term missions. Do you know what I mean in terms of what it actually does with the local context? We should. But mission trips are powerful for the kids who go on them. And so, you know, when we can do those appropriately, they can become very significant for them. Camps, again, are a wonderful place to be invested with our kids because they get to be in a space where they actually are stretched beyond their capacities and they get to experience God work through them in powerful ways. It's transforming for them. So we look for opportunities for our kids to actually experience Jesus. Number 7, your kids belong to Jesus more than they belong to you. So I already mentioned that we remember that we have been entrusted with these children for a time, but ultimately God has them, and ultimately He loves them more than we love them. Isn't that beautiful? I think that God actually loves our kids even more than we love them, and so we remember that, and that allows us to not have to control everything. And it allows us to go through the difficulties with like emotional realism, but also with much hope. And we have to have both of those in the midst of those spaces. We need to be emotionally real with what's taking place, but part of what should be a reality of our emotions is the hope that we have in God and His hand on our kids. Number 8, we need to be a prophetic voice in the lives of our kids. And what we found in renegotiating faith is that kids will always find someone who can give them a vision of a preferred future. And so they'll look for those voices, whether it's a teacher, whether it's a coach, whether it's a peer, whether it's an online influencer, someone who will paint a preferred future for their reality. And of course, as parents, we actually get to have that voice. And I think one of the most powerful places we can have those voices is when we begin to experience the strength of our kids, and maybe we're experiencing it not in redemptive ways, but in really difficult ways that's maybe kind of shaped by their sin, but then we can give them a vision of what it's going to look like as God continues to form them. And takes that strength that feels so like negative and destructive and begins to use it for something so good. And there was, so again with PK, this is not a parenting win. The first time I threatened to kick Peyton out of our home, he was 8 years old. So that was the start. That's a true story. That's a true story. It was a battle. I remember the very first time Peyton, when he was still in diapers, he turned to his mom and wham, headbutted her right in the nose. And that was our first disciplining moment that we had. I remember that. It was a struggle. I remember when PK was, we're not recording this. Well, we are recording this. Okay.
No, you gotta tell the story now, so we'll tell the story now.
That's great.
I'll send it to PK later.
You can't actually peek at it. By the way, funny story. Peyton preached at his church for the very first time in the fall, and guess who was the center of his stories? I've made a living off the stories of PK, so I was like, that's not fair. I remember when PK was 16, and he came into our room, and he was angry, and he would cycle when he got angry. And I said, son, you need to get out of our room. He's like, I ain't going. I said, hey, buddy, you're of age right now where we don't do spankings anymore. And you're not leaving our room. This is your parents' room. And I'm asking you to leave. And if you don't leave, I'm going to help you leave. He's like, I ain't leaving. Yeah, you're leaving. And, I remember dragging him down the hallway and down the stairs and tossing him out the door. And I said, hey, when you're ready to make it right, you come back. But not till then. Stinker. 5 minutes later, he wants to make it right. He was always good at saying sorry, and I was never quite ready at that point. It was really hard. I was like, well, I'm not ready yet. But when I would settle a couple of days later, and the emotion subsided, I could sit down and say, hey, kiddo, this strength you have that creates so much tension here, as God gets a hold of it, it's going to make you powerful. It's going to make you powerful for His work. And I'm struggling with it now, but I wouldn't have it any other way because there's something greater coming. And we're seeing the fruit of that. And we're seeing the fruit of that strength. And so we keep being this prophetic vision for our kids. Does that make sense? And again, we have to fight to have God's vision for our children because in the midst of the struggle, it's very hard to see it with our own eyes. But we become this prophetic voice. We continue to engage with hope. We continue to share possibility. Number 9, we need to be a listening voice in our kids' lives. And especially as they start moving up through middle adolescence towards late, we start learning to ask good questions, not just give good answers. I have found that to be a very difficult transition to become a person who asks questions. In fact, this was a couple of years ago when they were coming home, I thought, I want to ask better questions of my boys. Like, I want to see if I can do this. So I actually went online and I just Googled great questions to ask young adults. And so I got a list of them. I thought it was so cool. And I remember we sat down at the table and I was like, hey boys. And so I kind of looked down. I did it. I asked him the question. All of a sudden Cole goes, Dad, did you just look at your phone? He's like, did you search good questions to ask? You just asked me this. I look at him and go, that's how much I love you, man. So I was like, so just shut up and answer the question. That doesn't quite work either. But learning to become a question asker. I talked to my friend Steve who Ben works for directly. Steve is one of the best question askers. And I asked him, hey, give me some ways to think about questions. And a couple of principles. He said, it's just first, asking questions wins the day. It opens up opportunity. Don't assume you use the same words in the same way when you're talking. So be careful about that. Which means, hey, what do you mean when you use the word this? So the other day I asked Cole, he was talking about a preacher, he said, yeah, that guy's so conservative. I said, so what does conservative mean to you? And so then it just opened up a great conversation we could have. He said, texting sometimes works better than talking. I'll never forget when a friend of mine came to me and just said, hey Sid, in those seasons when you're really struggling with PK, why don't you try texting a little bit? It feels a little less threatening. I was like, no kidding. And so I did, and it started building like real rapport. What they call it is phatic communication, when small amount of words have greater impact or meaning than what you think. And especially with texting, what happens is when we engage in like humor or questions through text, it says to people on the other side, oh, I belong to you, I'm a part of your circle, you're thinking about me. When we do it in non-threatening ways. And he actually said to me, he said, Sid, send like a GIF or a meme or just a joke. Don't parent them on the text. And I was like, that's really hard. And so that became a space that actually started to build relationship. And then what was fascinating is when Peyton started going through some real struggles, he started texting me, Dad, I'm struggling with pornography. That's part of his public story. And he goes, could you pray for me? I'm like, oh yeah. And then I remember I thought, oh, we're going to talk about this. And so as soon as I got the text, I went and found him. I said, hey, I'd love to talk to you. I don't want to talk about that. So you got to be live. You know what I mean? Like there's a time and place. But it was shocking how that just removes from the threatening nature and allowed communication to start. Talking while doing something can lower the temperature. And then finally, number 5, don't quit pursuing. And what I would say here is, make sure you don't quit inviting. I remember when Marv came to me, my mentor, and he just said, Sid, whenever you have a struggle with your children, be the first to open the door of invitation back into relationship. And he said, do it sooner rather than later. And so I would go to PK and say, hey buddy, whenever you're, hey, we'd love to have you, mom and dad are going downtown, we'd love to buy ice cream, and come jump in the car. And Jen would be the one that would say, hey, you need to go talk to him. I said, well, he hasn't said sorry yet. She goes, grow up, you know, like, get over yourself, you know. And so we were always trying to open the door to get him in quick. And then finally, principle number 10 is pray. And, you know, here's the reality, especially when it comes to passing faith on to the next generation, it's going to require more resources than what you and I have, correct? Which is why we pray. For some reason, God has ordained that his power is released through prayer. And we don't get to control the timelines, and we don't get to control kind of the circumstances, but we can come before the Father, and we can control our hearts before God through prayer and ask him to do more than we could ever dream or imagine. Immeasurably more than we could dream or imagine. Okay, we are at the end of our time for this session. That was a lot. Woo, we're getting after it. And we're going to have some lunch, and then we're going to come back for a really easy conversation on gender, sex, and sexuality. It's going to be so fun. I know, right? So go for a walk, clear your mind, and hey, at any time through lunch, if you want to come chat, come grab me, that'd be great. And we'll have more time for questions after. Ben?
Yeah, do you have any instructions that are about